Hi, my name is Sarah Prager. I am so excited to be back at True Colors. I wish we were all together, but I'm happier that we're staying safe. Um, I am going to give a presentation today on LGBTQ plus history and all the incredible stories of our amazing ancestors who came before us. Let's see. So, our history is diverse and it is sometimes painful. We're going to talk about all of it, and I'll give a more specific content warning soon. First, I'd like to introduce myself a little. That's me when I had long hair not too long ago, with my wife, who works in Cromwell, Connecticut, and our kids. We all live in Massachusetts, close to the Connecticut border. I grew up in Simsbury, and we used to live in Wallingford. So Connecticut is home, and our little baby is going to be 1 next month, and our 3-year-old is going to be 4. And I grew up not always knowing that I was queer. I came out to myself around the age of 13, came out to others around the age of 14, and taught myself queer history to get a sense of community, develop my sense of identity, and it helped me to understand that I was not alone and not the first person to feel this way, and that my ancestors had done incredible things and that I could too. And that representation and connection to those historical figures completely changed my life. So I dedicated my life to sharing stories like that with people like you. In 2013, I came out with an app called Quist, which is free and teaches what happened today in LGBTQ history. So, for June 1st, you might see it coming out, or you might see a law being passed, or some other historical event. Uh, it is currently only available for Apple devices. We need a little more funding to get back on the Google Play store, so I'm sorry about that. My first book, Queer There and Everywhere, came out in 2017 for teens, and my second book, Rainbow Revolutionaries, just came out a few weeks ago in May. And that is more for middle schoolers, but it's really pretty illustrated book, so people of all ages can enjoy that. So I often talk about queer history. I've been saying LGBTQ plus history, but the truth is the words L and G and B and T and Q are all pretty recent. The word transgender is only from the 1970s, but trans history goes back much further than the 1970s. So I use queer as an umbrella term for the purposes of this presentation for anyone not cis, anyone not straight, in any way by our time and places standards or their time and places standards. Can we call somebody trans who could never have self-identified as trans because the word didn't exist? It's a complicated question for historians, but like I was saying about seeing yourself represented in somebody else, I think that's much more important than the terminology. And all of these stories fit under the broad umbrella term of queer history. And that they're telling their stories is more important than how we label them, I think, while acknowledging their queerness. And then I do also want to say, talking about the past, these people have passed away, sometimes in unpleasant ways. They have lived through discrimination and hardship. And while this presentation is overall going to be pretty uplifting. We are also going to be mentioning those things, so feel free to step away, skip, mute, X out, whatever you need to do. So I am going to give a little more info about queer history in general. I'm going to tell 6 people's specific stories, and I still have a Q&A in my slide. I am available for Q&A on my social media and my email if you'd like. So, what do you already know about queer history? I'm going to give you a second. If you could just pause the video for 5 or 10 seconds and just think about what are the people, the events, the concepts, the feelings, anything that you think of when you hear queer history. Pause. All right, unpause. For many people, the first thing they might think of is Stonewall. So Stonewall is the Stonewall Inn is a queer bar still in operation. You know, before and hopefully after the pandemic. In New York City, in Greenwich Village, and there had been riots for for queer rights before the riots at Stonewall. There had been protests, there had been organizing. Nothing had taken off quite like the riot at the Stonewall Inn in 1969, which started on a night in June, which is why we celebrate Pride in June. It's the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, and those riots were against the police for harassment and always, for their enforcement of the laws that were anti-queer. Thankfully, many of those laws have been changed, not all of them, but being queer was illegal in just about every possible way in 1969. From all the way down to dancing with someone of the same sex was illegal, wearing too much clothing of the sex you were not assigned at birth was illegal. So the Stonewall Inn was a completely criminal business, and everyone inside was considered a criminal. And police would come and round up people and put them in paddy wagons and take them to jail for being queer and no other crime beyond that. And the harassment by police and non-police was really tough. And so one night in June 1969, the people at the bar in Stonewall fought back against being arrested. And it was a violent riot. There are lots of nonviolent, peaceful moments in our history. This is not one of them. And it was led by trans women of color, which is really important to remember. And Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and Stormé DeLarverie are all in this book. So that was Stonewall. If you thought of something else, I would love to see if it ends up coming up later in the presentation. But yeah, if not, it's still just fun to think about. So another question, how far back does queer history go? The answer, since you can't give me any, is all of human history, right? So there is a lot of pre-1969 history. There's a lot of pre-United States history and a lot of pre-colonial history. So one of the ways that we know that queerness existed, even potentially before the written word, are deities like this Hindu one that you see here, who is presenting as half dressed and presenting as male, and the other half female. And stone statues carved into cave temples have been found of this deity dating back thousands of years. So that's just one example of how we know the concept of male and female in one person has existed a really long time. We see deities that might have been considered intersex or non-binary, or any other way of more than one sex or gender existing in one person. Um, in deities and origin stories, and mythology from around the entire world, every inhabited continent, there's evidence of that. And constructions and concepts of gender, sex, and sexuality have changed a lot over time, and many cultures had very different ideas than just male and just female. One example of that is two-spirit people, who in the US we might think of as part of US history or pre-US history, but it's really all of the Americas had two-spirit people, from Canada to Chile. And dozens of tribes have evidence of, dating back hundreds of years, of people who were a third gender or fourth or fifth, etc., of some kind. So these are two-spirit people in Chile, and the photo's over 100 years old, and they are a third gender, and so that's just one more example of how queer people in many different ways, well, in many of these tribes, these two-spirit people were revered and honored for their special gift of being able to have male and female spirits in one person. Um, not just tolerated or accepted, but honored. And in many parts of the world, the arrival of white Christian European men is what ended that time of acceptance and celebration of queerness and a diversity of queerness. And yeah, it is a huge and tragic part of our history, that many ways to be queer were just erased centuries ago. So, getting into the 6 stories of different people, I have a question. What do the high five and the computer have in common? So, sometimes people get this right away. One of the best answers I ever got was digital connection. So, like digits connecting for a high five. Um, a dad gave that answer, of course. But the answer I'm looking for, if you haven't gotten it, is that they were both invented by gay guys. Yeah, the high five has an inventor. So does the computer, and they were both invented by gays. 2 of many inventions that we've given the world. The inventor of the computer is generally and widely considered to be Alan Turing, even though many people worked on the concepts of computer science around the same time. Alan lived in the UK, and you might have seen his story in The Imitation Game, a 2014 biopic about him. And he created something that he called a universal machine. It could compute anything. And he made this invention as part of a code-breaking effort for the Allies in World War II, trying to break the code that the Nazis were using to communicate. And he succeeded after months of effort and was able to break that code and help to shorten the war and help to win the war. Unfortunately, Alan was also gay, and that was illegal, just like it was in the US. It was in the UK in his time, and in 1952, he was given a choice after his conviction. He could either spend 2 years in prison, or he could accept a treatment called chemical castration, which was forced estrogen injections with the goal of dulling his libido and therefore curing his homosexuality. He chose the injections so that he could continue his work by staying out of jail. But with a criminal conviction, he lost his security clearance and his job and was not able to continue his work in the same way, even though he was working on incredible new breakthroughs in his field. He passed away not long after. Whether his death was a suicide or accidental is debated. So, Alan obviously has a very sad story, and I tell it because it reminds us of why we fight against discriminations like homophobia, not just for his life that he deserved to live fully, but also for everyone, queer and not queer. Imagine what else he could have given the world in decades more of his work when we're not all at the table with all of our ideas being fully accepted and valued. Everyone misses out. And so Alan's story also makes me think of Lynn Conway, who was also working in a similar field not that long after. She was working at IBM in the 1960s on microprocessors, and that are in kind of all phones and everything today. Incredible breakthroughs as well. And she was legally fired for transitioning from male to female while at work. And the difference that a few more years of activism can make is that Lynn is not only alive today, but working in tech today as a career. And so we want voices like Lynn's at the table, brilliant minds, and it's one of the many reasons to fight against transphobia and homophobia and other discriminations. So the inventor of the high five is Glenn Burke, who played for Major League Baseball, and he co-invented the high five with another player, just in a spontaneous moment coming around home plate in the 1970s. And the Dodgers considered it a Dodgers thing. They were selling t-shirts about high fives, and then it became a baseball thing, and then a sports thing, and then an everywhere thing. Pretty recently, the 1970s. So he came out on the Today Show in 1982, which is a lot earlier than almost any public coming out you'll hear about. And he played in a gay softball league after leaving Major League Baseball prematurely over basically being forced out for being gay. So these are the illustrations of Alan and Glenn as they appear in the new book, Rainbow Revolutionaries. I wanted to show those. So the third story is Kristina Vasa, known as Kristina of Sweden, and they gave up the throne in 1654 because being queen would have meant they had to marry a man, and they did not want to. And so much so that they gave up being queen and moved to Rome and lived their best life without the power and castle and all of that. Kristina dressed as male and female in different times, dated men and women, um, possibly ace, possibly intersex, um, kind of um, used their birth name most of the time, but during their travels from Sweden to Rome, took on a male name temporarily for their travels before returning to the name Kristina. And I mean, finding a modern label to put on this person who was umbrella term queer can be challenging, but I think a lot of different people of all genders and all sexual orientations and romantic orientations can possibly see themselves um, reflected in this person. So it's somebody to look more into. And then a doctor, Alan L. Hart, who actually uh, ended up in New Haven for the later part of his life. He was a doctor who did research into tuberculosis, finding it in the lungs through x-rays. And x-rays weren't even invented when he was born. So it was a pretty cutting edge technology. And tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the US. Uh, and he dramatically flattened the curve on it, with being able to detect it earlier through his research. Um, he was not only a medical pioneer professionally, but also personally. Um, and his hysterectomy was the first of its kind that we have documented in the US. So 100 years ago, a pioneer in gender affirmation surgeries in his own life, and started taking testosterone when it became available as a synthetic hormone in the 1940s. Um, and so just one of the earlier people to pursue physical transitions. And that's what he contributed to in uh, um, flattening the curve in TB. And then there's Kristina and Alan's portraits. And I love how the illustrator Sarah Papworth did things like write out Alan's name in bones for his x-ray, a little tribute to that. And Kristina's got crowns all over their name and things like that. A lot of details to look for in the illustrations. All right, and our last set of two is Juana Inés de la Cruz, who lived around the same time as Kristina in Mexico City, and was always grew up wanting to be educated. Women were not allowed to go to school, and getting married to a man was kind of the only option for um, having any kind of access to food and shelter. But she found a way around that by becoming a nun, which was a way to um, be able to live without getting married. And she spent her time as a nun studying and becoming one of the most prolific poets of the Spanish language of all time. And her poetry did include love poems to her benefactor's wife. And then finally, Bayard Rustin, who was the a lead organizer of the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where the I Have a Dream speech was delivered. Bayard was a big believer in nonviolence and one of the main people who convinced Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders of the civil rights movement to use nonviolence as their primary tactic. He was already sitting on the front of a bus in protest years before Rosa Parks. He was arrested many times, but his 1953 arrest was for hooking up with a guy, and which was illegal. And so this arrest this record kept him somewhat in the shadows of the movement, while other people could be the person out front. This kind of shadow kept him in the shadows. As time went on, you can see he lived till 1987. He worked for queer rights later in his life, while always continuing to work for racial justice as well. And he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously by Barack Obama, and his partner Walter accepted it for him at the White House. And there's Juana and Bayard as they appear in Rainbow Revolutionaries. So, these 6 people, maybe you connect with one of them in terms of a certain identity, or you want to be a doctor when you grew up, like Alan, or an athlete like Glenn, or maybe you want to give up all your responsibilities and run away to Rome like Kristina, or an activist like Bayard. Queer people have done all of these things, and you can too. So, Queer There and Everywhere and Rainbow Revolutionaries are both available through lots of different libraries around Connecticut and New England and the country. They're both available as ebooks and hardcovers, if that is accessible through your library right now. Rainbow Revolutionaries is also available as an audiobook. If you'd like to buy them, it's a great time to support independent bookstores. And the one helping me with my book tour with signed copies is Book Club on the Go. And you can find links to buy both of those books through them if you search for Book Club on the Go on her website. So I would love to be able to discuss all of this with you, hear your questions and your comments and reactions. So I'm around on social media, and you can contact me through my website too, to email if you would like. So thank you very much. I hope you all have as happy a Pride as possible, and I will see you online. Thank you.